morning. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here this morning. We're starting Matthew chapter 22. How I'm planning on divvying this up is starting with the first parable that you see in the beginning of the chapter, and then the rest of the chapter kind of goes together. It's a series of interactions, and really that's actually what chapters 21 and 22 are, is a series of interactions between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. And so today we're going to look a little more detailed at this parable, as it's called, of the wedding feast. And then, Lord willing, next week we're going to look into some of these interactions through the rest of the chapter. And so my hope is that we can actually finish this series pretty soon, but we'll see. Things slow down when you get to what's commonly called the Passion Week. And so we'll slow down when we need to slow down, but we might pick up the pace at certain points as well. So as we've looked at already a couple weeks ago, Jesus has just entered Jerusalem. This is the triumphal entry. He enters on the donkey and the colt, and they have sort of a royal procession going in front of him with the laying of the cloaks and the branches and so on and so forth. And so he enters Jerusalem, and he goes to the temple. He cleanses the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers and the chairs of the bird sellers and so on and so forth. And so this point in the story, when Jesus enters Jerusalem, this is where the story begins to slow down considerably. I've talked about this the last couple of weeks, and it's worth pointing out again that in terms of how this narrative is shaping out, you have roughly 3 years of the beginning of Jesus' ministry up to this point, taking up the bulk of the book. Then you get to chapter 21, and the rest of these 8 chapters or so take up about a week's worth of real time. And so Matthew and the other gospel writers do this as well. They slow down, and that shows us that what they're talking about is important, and it's worth looking at here. And so this is where the story slows down. And what we're doing as well, thinking narrative-wise in terms of how the story is unfolding, we're reaching to the climax. We're building up to the climax of the story, which is, of course, Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And this is not just the climax of Matthew's gospel, but it's the climax of the entire Bible. And so we are inching our way to that point. We're getting eventually to the climax. It's kind of different from other narratives. A typical story, the climax kind of happens in the middle. You have the rising action, and then you reach the peak, and then you have sort of the declining action where the story kind of wraps up. With these gospel accounts, and Matthew is no exception, it's a little different. You're reaching, and then the climax is the end. And then the story wraps up in a nice little bow at the end as well. And so we're inching our way to that point. And so since the middle of chapter 21, Jesus has been in the midst of a back and forth discussion with the Jewish leaders. And it's interesting looking at the particular leaders that Jesus is having this discussion with. It kind of goes back and forth between different groups. And so you read in chapter 21 and 23, he enters the temple, and it's the chief priests and the elders. Well, we're going to get to a point where next week we'll look at the Pharisees come in. They ask him the question about paying taxes to Caesars. Then the Sadducees come in. They ask him the question about the resurrection. And then a lawyer comes and asks a question about the greatest command, so on and so forth. And so we're getting kind of a hodgepodge of all of these Jewish leaders coming and questioning Jesus, and the theme is the same. They're trying to entrap Jesus here. And this is the dynamic of the conversation, where we read at the end of chapter 21 that the Jews want to arrest Jesus. They want to put him away. And so what we see with this is Jesus is dealing with a hostile crowd. He's dealing with hostile listeners. If you've ever dealt with hostile people before, you understand that dynamic is different than if you're talking with someone, especially in a teaching kind of a way, and it's different if they are receptive, if it's good soil, so to speak. These people are not good soil. It's like throwing a seed and it falls on concrete, that sort of thing. It's like talking to a brick wall. These people are trying to entrap Jesus, and Jesus masterfully works his way out of it every time. And so that's an important detail to point out as well, shaping the context of some of these things that Jesus says. And so we've looked at the last couple of sections, a couple of parables that Jesus tells, and there's actually a triad of parables. If you pay attention to Matthew, he does a lot of things in sets of threes. That's a very Jewish thing to do, which kind of further cements the idea of Matthew being a Jew and writing to Jewish readers primarily. And so the first of these parables is the parable of the two sons. Father goes to two sons. He asks them if they'll go work in his vineyard. One says no, but then he goes and does it. The other says yes, and then he doesn't do it. Right? That's the first parable. The second parable is the parable of the tenants, where you have these tenants. A man owns a vineyard. He has tenants over it, and he sends his servants to go and to receive the fruit that he is owed. They kill his servants, and they even go as far as killing his son. So that's the second parable. And today we're going to look at what's commonly called the parable of the wedding feast. And so one thing to notice about these parables, think first of all what the purpose of a parable is. A parable is a realistic story to perhaps make a bigger point about something. And so these may not necessarily be true stories, but they're things that could happen, right? And so the purpose behind these stories is to use them to inform, to make a bigger point. One thing to notice about these parables is the intended audience is these hostile Jewish leaders. That's one thing to keep in mind. Sometimes we read these and Jesus might come off as harsh, and in the parable today, he will especially come off as harsh. But given the nature of the interaction and given what they are wanting to do to Jesus, I think his harshness is warranted. And so, that's one thing to point out. He's dealing with a hostile audience. Another thing to notice, and I'll point this out more as we get through it, these parables are building off of each other, and they are becoming more dramatic in each instance until eventually, with the telling of this third one, it kind of reaches a climax. It reaches a boiling point. And another thing, we'll study this more next week, Lord willing, but notice that the Jewish leaders, they are not going to respond accordingly to what Jesus is telling them. He's highlighting to them, I'm kind of spoiling it, but we've seen it with the first couple. He's highlighting their failures as Jewish leaders. He's highlighting what they have done wrong, how they went wrong, and the consequences for that, especially so today in the parable of the wedding feast. But instead of repenting, instead of changing, instead of looking inward and realizing the error of their ways, they double down on it. And in fact, we read in verse 15 of this chapter, this is the beginning of the next section, they begin to try to entangle him in his words. This is where you have the Pharisees come, and then the Sadducees come, and then a lawyer comes. All of them have this in common. They're trying to entangle Jesus in his words. They're trying to incriminate him so that they can arrest him and eventually have him killed. And so with that, let's read this parable together, the parable of the wedding feast, Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 1. It says, "And again Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son, and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. Again he sent other servants, saying, Tell those who are invited, See, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, The wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find. And those servants went out in the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, Bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. So before we get into some of the details of this parable in terms of what's going on, let's highlight some of the characters that we read of in this parable. You have a king. The king is kind of the main character of this parable. And what we see him doing is he's throwing a wedding feast for his son. His son is getting married. He throws a wedding feast for him. You also have the king's servants who are sent out to call those who are invited to the feast. That phrase, calling those who are invited, is kind of interesting. We'll highlight that as we get a little further. Next, there are those who are initially invited, but they end up not showing. And then you eventually have those who are invited afterward, and so on and so forth. This parable, by most accounts, seems to have a pretty straightforward interpretation, and it seems allegorical in nature. Well, what I mean by that is each person has a specific application. And so the king who's throwing the feast would be God. The son who's throwing the feast for is God's son, Jesus, right? The wedding feast, and so each particular part has a particular application. The wedding feast, most people assume, is salvation. Some people refer to it different ways, but really it's salvation. The end, right? The servants who he sent are the prophets. And this coincides with the parable he told previously. He sent the servants to go to the vineyard. They end up killing those servants, just as they killed the prophets. Same thing happens here. You have the first set of invitations, the first set of people who were invited. And most people, there's variations when you get this far, but most people assume that this is talking about the Jewish mission. They reject the invitation, just as they reject Christ, right? Then you have the final set of invitations where they go out and they invite everyone they can find. And this final set of invitations is the Christian mission. They actually come and they show up to the wedding feast, and so on and so forth. One thing that's interesting about this imagery, one thing about parables is Jesus uses them. He uses things that would have been common analogies for them in that period of time. Some of the imagery might get lost on us because we're living 2,000 years later and we're living in a different part of the world, in a different culture, very different. But these would have been common things for the hearers of these, the initial hearers of them. And when dealing with Jewish leaders, the imagery of a feast is an interesting one. Because on the one hand, wedding feasts would have been pretty common at that period of time, especially for kings to throw and so on and so forth. But the Jewish people had a specific thing about feasts. It was a common image that they thought of in terms of salvation or eschatology, if you want to go that far, so on and so forth. And so what they kind of thought of is salvation being sort of like going to a heavenly banquet, sitting, reclining with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that sort of thing, dining with the patriarchs. And we see an example of this in Matthew 8 where Jesus alludes to this previously. This is the story of the faith of the centurion servant. We assume that that servant is a Gentile. He comes and, or the example of the centurion with his servant, where Jesus heals the centurion's servant. We assume the centurion is a Gentile. And what Jesus goes on to say about that centurion is, not in Israel have I seen such great faith. And he goes on to say, starting in Matthew 8 and verse 11, I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. That would have been a provocative thing for Jewish people to hear, because that's saying these Gentiles, people from the east and the west, right? That's Jesus' way of referring to Gentiles. They're going to be at this banquet that they thought they had an invitation to. And they thought they were the exclusive people being there. And so many people from the east and west will come and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place they'll be weeping and gnashing in teeth. So what we see is a similar instance here of this imagery that Jesus, he brings out first in Matthew 8 with the centurion and the healing of his servant. And then you see it here as well with his interaction with these Jewish leaders, with this parable. In Matthew 8, again, many will come from the east and the west, and they'll recline with the patriarchs. And the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. So this is one example of what we see as the Jewish expectation of the end, how the end will take shape. We have depictions in the New Testament of it. Jesus will return. He'll come from the clouds. He'll call those to go with him. The dead in Christ will rise first, and will go and will be with the Lord forevermore, right? We read that in 1 Thessalonians 4. And so we have a depiction of that. This is sort of the Jewish way of thinking about that in their religion. They think of salvation and they think of heaven as this sort of heavenly banquet. And Jesus, I think, is kind of poking and prodding at that imagery here, something that they would have had a pretty clear understanding of. So we see that the king sends his servants to those who were invited. This is going back now to the beginning of the parable. So he's throwing this wedding feast for his son. He goes and he gets those who were invited. The language here is interesting, and it implies that it's not as if... Sometimes we know people that get married and so on, and they send invitations, and it might be last minute. They send you an invite, and it's 2 weeks away or something. And it's like, this is a little sudden. I don't know if I can go to it. This is not what's happening here. This is not the servants going and sending the invitations. It's implied that they were already invited. And so what we see happening here is this isn't an invitation, but it's a notice that what they have been invited to is going to happen. And so what we see happening here is they don't come, right? And so them no-showing, it seems, based on the language here, to be them flaking on a commitment that they've already made. That's what's happening here. They've said they're going to do something. They may have RSVP'd or what have you if they had that sort of thing back then. They didn't have Facebook events, I know that much, where you could click yes or no or whatever. But it seems like they've made this commitment to come to this wedding feast, and now they don't come. And what happens here is the feast is ready. The feast is ready, but there's no one there, right? So you can kind of see, if you throw a big party and you expect all these people to come and they don't show up, that's obviously a problem. And it's interesting as Matthew depicts this story, because there's a parallel to this in Luke, to this parable. As Matthew depicts it, they give no excuses. They just don't show up. That comes off as very rude, very inconsiderate, right? Think if someone did that to us, if maybe someone RSVP'd for an event, then they just don't show up and they don't tell you, they don't give you any warning that they're not going to come. And it's interesting because in Luke, as Luke depicts this, they give excuses. They're sorry excuses, but they at least attempt to give excuses. Well, in Matthew, they don't do that. And so as Matthew is telling the story here, they come off as crude and harsh, and they are implicitly even more guilty, these people. Because not only are they not showing up, but they're not giving any excuse or anything. They're not even making an attempt. It's not... They're not making any excuses. And it's kind of like if you have watched the show Friends, there's a pretty famous line in there, and I use this a lot, actually, and I haven't even watched Friends that much. I didn't think it was that funny, but this is a funny moment where they ask Phoebe for help. She says, I wish I could, but I don't want to. They don't even do that. They just don't show up. Next time someone asks me for help, I might use this on them. I wish I could, but I don't want to. CJ, have I ever used that on you? Maybe not quite that harsh. And so the king sends out his servants to tell the people, hey, this banquet's going to happen, this feast. They don't show up. And so what happens next is the king sends his servants out again. This is kind of a rare occurrence. You think of a king is a person of high status. Usually kings aren't the ones to seem desperate like this, right? And so, and I don't think that the king's doing this out of desperation. He's doing this out of grace. Hey, you need to come to this banquet. You're going to miss it if you don't come. And so he extends another invitation. Invitation's probably not the right word, but he extends another opportunity for them to come. And this would have been a rarity, especially for that period of time. Usually, a king invites you to something, you make sure that you're there, right? And so, the king again extends an opportunity for them to come. But this time he adds a little bit of incentive. This time he tells them, everything is ready. It's like the song we sing, all things are ready, come to the feast, right? Everything's ready. The fatted calves or the fatted oxen have been slaughtered. The whole kit and caboodle is here. You need to come to this banquet. And yet they still don't. Some simply go off. They go some to their farms, some to their businesses. That kind of covers both classes of people, white collar, blue collar. They go their separate ways. But then there are some, the rest, as Matthew says, who seized his servants. They treated them shamefully, as the ESV puts it, and then eventually they killed them. So they seize them, they treat them shamefully, and they kill them. And what you see happening here is it's kind of building off of each other. It's kind of reaching a climax here. Things are escalating. First they seize the servants, then they treat them shamefully, and eventually they kill them. You can kind of see the escalation that is taking shape here. And I think that's something that Jesus, as he's telling the parable, is doing on purpose. And we've seen him do it before. And in fact, this is kind of the pattern of these three parables itself, which I'll point out here in a moment. So they escalate things, right? They seize the servants, they more or less torture them, and then they end up killing them. Well, that escalation leads to an escalation on the part of the king. And so he responds accordingly. And again, some people read this and it seems harsh, and maybe it is harsh, but I think it's warranted given what they have done to these servants in the context of the parable, and given what these Jews are going to do to Jesus. The response is warranted. And so as we read in verse 7, the king sends his troops. They destroy the murderers. Notice the strong language he uses. He calls them murderers. That's exactly what these Jews are. Even though they're not necessarily the ones driving the nails into Jesus as he hangs on the cross, they're the ones who organize it. Just like when you hire someone to kill someone, they arrest you and them, right? You're implicit in it as well. And so they are implicit in the death of Jesus that is coming. They are the organizers of it. And so he calls them murderers, and eventually he burns their city. Some see that mention of him burning their city as an allusion to 70 A.D. when Jerusalem is destroyed. I don't know if you could read that into it or not, but it's an interesting point that you could make. There's some more things that are kind of implied in that if you assume that this is fulfilled in 70 A.D. But I digress. And so what we see happening here in this particular parable, in this third one, just the first two happen at the end of chapter 21, this again is an escalation. Do you remember when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, and as the devil tempted Jesus, those temptations escalated? With each temptation, it was more and more enticing, right? Well, this is a common thing that we see in Matthew's gospel, and we see it in this particular parable with the escalation of how they treat the servants. But we also see it in the parables themselves. On the one hand, you have the parable of the two sons, and what Jesus ends up telling them after that parable is the tax collectors and the prostitutes will enter the kingdom before them. That would be hard to hear, but Jesus says that to them. And then the next parable, the parable of the tenants, these are even their words as they're responding to Jesus' question as to what the owner of the vineyard should do. They say they need to put those wretches to a miserable death and then give the vineyard to other people. The kingdom is taken from them and it's given to the church, right? And now with this parable, he not only destroys the murderers, but he burns down their city. This again is an escalation. And what we see happening here, this is kind of fitting given where we're going with the story. The story itself is escalating. We're escalating eventually to the point where Jesus is going to be crucified. And so as we inch closer and closer to that, the interactions that Jesus has with the Jewish leaders, it begins to become a little more intense as we go along. And Jesus will really reach a boiling point with them in chapter 23 Lord willing, we'll talk about that when we get there. The 7 woes, as it's called in that chapter. So now, as the parable continues on, the king sends more servants to invite more guests. The ones who were initially invited, who ended up not showing up, they're gone now. And so he sends servants to invite more guests. And the reason is because those who were invited first were not worthy. They were not worthy. And the reason they weren't worthy is because they didn't accept the invitation. That's why they weren't worthy. And what we see again, the feast is ready. And in terms of the parable, this sort of creates a sense of urgency. And think about if you're throwing a party yourself, if you expect people to come to this party, so say you order pizzas or something, or you work hard and you make a dish or something, and people don't show up, but the food is ready. You need people to show up and eat that food, or else the food's going to go bad, or you're going to have to freeze it, or it's a dire situation. So it creates a sense of urgency here within the parable, which is why the king says to invite to the feast as many as you find. Invite as many as you find, because of that sense of urgency. And what we see is the servants do as the king tells them, just as good servants do. They follow the orders of their king. And so they go, and they gather all that they could find. And notice he points out that it's both the bad and the good. That's an interesting point to make. Some people get confused about this, and they say, well, does that mean to say that there's going to be good people and bad people in heaven? Well, first of all, there's no such thing as good people in heaven. We're all bad people, right? We all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. So it's not anything like that. What we see happening here, it seems to me, and you could make a comparison to the parable of the tares, in terms of, at the end, the tares get gathered up along with the wheat and so on and so forth. There's another instance where the language that's used is very similar, where this is parable of the gathering of the fish. I'll go ahead and read it, just for the sake of being concise. In Matthew 13 and verse 47, it says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad." So in this parable in Matthew 13, you see all of the fish are gathered, and then at the end they're sorted out. Eventually, the king will sort out those, and we actually see that at the end. There's someone there who didn't have a wedding garment on. And so just because they've gathered them does not mean that they will stay, right? The Lord will sort those out later on. And we see that taking shape in verse 11. The king comes in and he looks at the guests. I think that language is interesting, referring to the king coming, because we're still waiting for our king to come and to sort out the guests to this day. This pertains then to the last judgment, when Jesus, our king, will come and we will be separated, the sheep from the goats, the good and the bad, however you want to think of it. There will be that separation that is made. And what we see happening here is he sees a man who had no wedding garment on. Now, there's a lot of discussion as to what specifically that could mean, and there's tie-ins to Revelation and so on and so forth. I think I might actually make a tie-in to Revelation at the end. But more or less, no matter how you view the specifics of this, the big picture idea here is you have someone here at this wedding feast who was not properly prepared. If you go to a wedding feast, you want to be properly dressed, right? You don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want to be underdressed. This is a person who did not have a wedding garment on, and so they were not properly prepared. There's a lot to say about being properly prepared for when Jesus returns, right? There's a lot of New Testament teachings about that. And we'll even cover some of those as we progress further in Matthew's Gospel, like in chapter 25, for example. So the king asks the servant about his lack of a garment. This is kind of a humorous interaction, it seems to me. He begins by saying, first of all, notice he addresses him as friend. He says, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?" And what does the man say back? He is speechless, right? It says that the man is speechless. This is similar to those who have refused to come. He has no excuse as to why he's there without a wedding garment. He doesn't even know how he got in. Sometimes we end up somewhere and we don't know how we got there, right? And I'm not talking about specific locations unless maybe you're intoxicated or something, but sometimes we're at a certain point in our life and we're like, how did I end up here? How did I get here? This is someone who doesn't know how he got there, and he has no excuse. And this is seen as a disrespectful act, not only to the king who is throwing this wedding feast, but it's also disrespectful to the son who the wedding feast is for. If you invite me to a wedding and I show up in a t-shirt or something, I'm not saying you have to wear a tuxedo to every wedding you go to, but you dress up somewhat for it. Maybe wear a collared shirt or something. Some people wear those t-shirts and it has a tuxedo on the t-shirt. I think those are so cheesy. You won't see me wearing one of those. Unless maybe CJ's wedding or something. That's something you wear to like a wedding rehearsal, not an actual wedding. And so this is seen as disrespectful. You come and you're not prepared. You don't have a wedding garment. This is disrespectful, not just to the king, but also to his son, who the wedding feast is for. And so we see an appropriate reaction. Again, it might seem harsh, but it's appropriate given the context of the parable itself and given also the context of who Jesus is telling this parable to these Jewish leaders. The one who is lacking the garment, the one who is not prepared for the wedding feast, is bound, and he is cast into, as Jesus refers to it here, the outer darkness in verse 13. This is an imagery that is used 2 other times by Jesus in Matthew's gospel account, and in each of those instances it refers to hell. We've already read one of them in chapter 8 and verse 12, Jesus referring to the sons of the kingdom who won't be invited to recline at the table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but they'll be cast into the outer darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And the other instances in Matthew chapter 25, all of these are similar instances pertaining to judgment. And so in chapter 25, that, if I recall, is the context of separating the sheep from the goats. They might precede that, actually. But the imagery is used in chapter 25 and verse 30. It does precede that, but it's another instance of judgment. The parable of the talents is when that's used. And so you see the outer darkness here is an image to refer to hell. And there's a lot of symbolism behind darkness, especially when you compare it to light. Darkness referring to evil, referring to wickedness, unrighteousness, so on and so forth. Light referring to godly things, right? You could think of 1 John chapter 1, God is light, in him there's no darkness at all. I'm actually going to refer to that in my sermon later. So you make the juxtaposition of darkness and light. If God is light, then darkness is the absence. Since darkness is the absence of light, by definition, darkness is the absence of God. What is the absence of God? It's hell. That's, when you think about hell, that's what it is. And so what we see here shaping out with this story, if you don't have your garment, if you are not prepared, you don't get to stay for the feast, despite being invited to it, despite even being gathered up to go to the feast. You have to be prepared. And so Jesus concludes the parable with this line: "For many are called, but few are chosen." That's an interesting phrase, because on the one hand, it almost seems like they're the same thing, to be called and to be chosen. But there actually is a distinction that's made, and the distinction is this. God calls many. In fact, the Bible says that God desires that all people will be brought back to repentance, right? And so in that sense, God calls all people to himself. But not all will receive and accept that call. That's why few are chosen. The ones who are chosen are the ones who accept God's call in obedience to him. So that's the distinction. God calls, I would go as far as saying he calls all people to himself, but not all will respond to that call. Jesus, when he went to the cross, he died there for all people, but not all people respond in faith to that. And so I think that's what it means when he says that many are called, but few are chosen. So what does this parable show us? It shows us a few things. what we see is, just as with the parable of the tenants, and keep in mind these parables are kind of building off of each other, reaching the escalation point. As with the parable of the tenants, the kingdom is going to be taken from the Jews and it's going to be given to the church. Think about the parable of the tenants, what the Jews themselves even say when Jesus asked them about, what would you do? They say, he will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons. So just as that master of the vineyard is going to do, God takes the kingdom from the Jews and he gives it to the church. The church is the kingdom of God today. And this is because of the failure of the Jewish leaders in particular. They have been like the shepherds that you read of in Ezekiel, the ones who don't look after the flock, but who, in fact, actually devour the flock. This is a failed leadership, and so God takes the kingdom and he gives it eventually to the church. Another thing we see, this is kind of an interesting point to make, the king is generous to throw the feast in the first place, right? He doesn't have to throw the feast. He doesn't have to invite other people to it. You think about weddings. Sometimes you have a big wedding. I think my parents had several hundred people at their wedding. I obviously wasn't there, so I don't know. But I think that's what I've been told. They had several hundred people there. But then sometimes you have a smaller, more intimate wedding. And sometimes we act entitled. Oh, I wasn't invited to the wedding. You know what? It's up to the people if they want to invite you there or not. The king is generous here to not just throw the feast, but to invite all these other people to it. In a word, this is grace. Offering goodwill to those who do not deserve it. That is the definition of grace. Undeserved favor. They don't deserve to be invited to the feast. It's not like they've done anything for it, just as we don't do anything for our salvation. We're not saved by works. We don't earn our salvation. Rather, we respond to it in obedience. We respond in faith to what God has done. But that's different than saying we earn it. And so this is grace. He offers goodwill to those who do not deserve it. And he not only invites them the first time, but he gives them another chance. He sends for them again. He gives them another opportunity, and they still don't take him up on it before he eventually does kill them and burn their city. And finally, what we see, I guess this isn't finally, I have one more after this one, but we see here also, this goes back to chapter 20, and this is kind of, this phrase here, and it's repeated in chapter 19 as well, it's kind of as a good summary of what we've been looking at in the recent chapters of Matthew that we've looked at, thinking of the last being first and the first being last. That's what the kingdom is in a nutshell when you think about it. We humble ourselves, God exalts us, that sort of thing. And thinking, of course, about the one who is first making himself last, speaking of Jesus, so that we who are last can become first, so on and so forth. We see this same idea shaping out in this parable. You have the ones who are invited first, they don't show up. So they're killed, thus being last. And then those who are invited last, they do show up to the wedding banquet. And so they're made first. And this is a paradox. Something you expect to happen is actually kind of inversely true, where the ones who are expected to be there, those who were invited initially, they are absent. So then what you have is the only ones there who are present are unexpected guests. Last-minute invitations are sent out, and they come. And so this is a paradox. It's kind of a reversal of the way it's supposed to be, which is true of the kingdom as well. And then finally, one last thing. Judgment is certain to come. If there's anything we can gather from this parable, it is the fact that there eventually will be a judgment. There is going to be this feast that happens, and the king's going to come. He's going to be ready to inspect us. He comes and he looks at his guests, and he notices someone who does not have a garment. And so what we need to ask ourselves is, are we ready? The king comes here, and looks at us, are we going to be ready? Have we our garments? And I like this imagery from Revelation 7. I'll go ahead and read it so I don't take it out of its context. This is the scene that John sees of the 144,000. This is what some religious people really get backwards on. A tidbit about this is it's interesting since I have a few minutes. One thing about Revelation, if you study it, there's a lot of attention that's given to sensory things. John hears things, he sees things, so on and so forth. A lot of seeing, a lot of hearing. And it's worth pointing out different things that he sees versus he hears. Like, for example, in chapter 5, he hears, right, the Lion of Judah has come, and he looks, and what does he see? It's actually a slaughtered lamb. So the seeing and the hearing are a little different. And we see another example of that here in chapter 7. He hears the number, and it's 144,000. But in verse 9, he looks, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, and they're standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands. And they cry out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits upon the throne and to the Lamb." And you go on through this, they're singing this song. And then one of the elders comes and asks John, "Who are these that are clothed in white robes?" This is in verse 13. "And from where have they come?" And I, being John, the writer of this, said to him, "Sir, you know." And he said to me, "These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of God," and so on and so forth. So if we made sure that our robes have been washed in the blood of the Lamb, are we ready for that day to come? I hope the answer, of course, is yes. Any comments or questions? Tom?
I kind of saw this as a brief history of Israel. The troops being foreign nations that came in and captured Israel and Judah and took them off. And the guy that's not dressed, I've always thought of him as a false prophet or a false teacher.
It's an interesting point that Tom makes. He kind of sees in this parable the history of Israel. The troops come and they destroy the city. You could make an application to the different exiles that Israel went through, first with Assyria and then later with Babylon pertaining to Judah. They come and they destroy the cities and so on and so forth. And the one without the garment, Tom thinks, could be a false prophet. That's something Israel had a lot of trouble with. Jesus addressed it several times as well. CJ?
When you study the history behind weddings in the first century, when you think of you get a date and you RSVP and it's very certain, well, as I understand it, it was just, hey, we're getting married in the X amount of weeks, be ready. We'll ring the bell, we'll call you, you just be ready. And even, if I remember right, if one did not have a wedding garment, there were wedding garments provided at the feast, so this guy has double no excuse because he could have gotten a wedding garment from the master.
CJ makes a couple of points. One is the fact that as he understands weddings from the first century, and it might be true, I haven't studied it, so I can't speak to it, but apparently at that time, it's not like today where you get an invitation well in advance and you RSVP and so on. They kind of make an announcement and they say, hey, you need to be ready for when it comes. And you can see that in other parables that are told, like the parable of the virgins, right? They're waiting for the bridegroom to come. They don't have the oil in their lamp, so they're not ready when he comes. You can kind of see that here as well. They weren't ready. And CJ makes a point, too, that if you didn't have a wedding garment, there could be one provided to you. And in CJ's words, this man was double guilty. Double guilty. That's a good one. I might have to use that. Nothing else. Thanks for your attention.